Welcome to the Pulling Each Other Along podcast, where we have the most wonderful guests in the world share their journeys of who and what pulled them along to their relative greatnesses in both business and life. Thanks for tuning in. The Pulling Each Other Along podcast starts right now. Again, this is Doug Cornfield with the Pulling Each Other Along podcast. And of course, we got another great guest, as always. But this one's a little more special right now for us because Dave Clark and I and Dave Stevens just did an event in Miami where we kind of last minute got asked to do this event, a clinic, one of our Disability Dream and Do sports camps. But we had just gotten hit with a hurricane. We just had 2 events canceled. And I started reaching out to some last minute partners to partner with us and help us out financially or even come to the event. And our current guest, John Brandis, was one of those guys in the West Palm Beach area, Miami area, extended area, wherever you are, John. And we asked him and he said, yep, I want to help. And so we're very grateful for him for sponsoring, partnering with us with our Disability Dream and Do clinic at the Abilities Clinic, which you can go to abilities.com and learn more about them as well. But so without further ado, John is a headhunter. And so I know he's trying to pull people along by getting him in the perfect dream job. And so we're going to discuss that and other aspects of John's life. So John, if you don't mind, say hello to folks, give a little better introduction than I can do to the Pulling Each Other Along podcast group.
Well, hello, everybody. And hello, Doug and Dave. Great to be here with you guys. And I think you summed it up. That was certainly the top line. Earlier this year in January, I started this business. I frankly didn't set out to be a headhunter. I initially thought I would do sales consulting. And I do that. That's a small part of my business. But pretty quickly found myself getting pulled into the recruiting and headhunting side of things. And, I was talking to my grandson and I was explaining to him what I do. I'm helping people find jobs. And he said, well, I guess you could say you're helping the community. And I had to think, I'm like, well, yeah, I guess I am. Didn't really set out with that mission, but that has been it. I've so far this year, I've placed 26 people and it's been an incredible journey so far.
Yeah. And I'm sure that's a big pivot because you had a long time other employment, other job that you were doing for years. And so to pivot like this, what's that transition?
It's been incredible. First and foremost, being your own boss is, of course, the dream for so many. And it feels amazing to have realized that in some small way this year. But yeah, I worked for 19 years in what I would call specialty finance, where basically the product was money, paying money now in exchange for more money in the future. Initially as a salesperson, and then as a manager, and then finally as a vice president and executive, ultimately a chief revenue officer of this team across 3 different brands. And it was a typical kind of corporate rat race kind of situation. And for a long time, I felt like I wasn't really aligned with my values, and I didn't really know. I was still trying to figure out what I want to do when I grow up. And sort of came to the conclusion late last year that whatever that next opportunity was going to be, whatever this next phase in my life, I was going to have to build it myself. And you're talking with my wife and through prayer, kind of came to the conclusion that, I didn't really know how it was going to go, but we were going to step out and see what came of it. And I'm, quite pleased to say that, so far this year, I've been able to, not have to dip into my savings and to have this, generate a living. And, like I said, I've helped a number of people, kind of get on a career path. And I'm pretty thrilled about that.
No, that's really great. And so before I pull Dave Clark into this, Dave Stevens is actually traveling back from Miami today. So we don't have Dave Stevens, but we have the infamous Dave Clark. And I know he's going to have some interesting things to talk about, plugging people in, hiring people from a sports perspective. But before we get into that, what was the thing that pulled you along for this big change? Was there a big something that created this for you to help pull you along toward this big change in your career?
Yeah. Like I said, I was feeling kind of rudderless and sort of adrift, and knowing that I wasn't in the right place and not knowing where the right place was or how to get there. And I had basically kind of committed to, allowing myself some bandwidth to figure it out. And I participated in a career accelerator program put on by the Morning Brew, which was really great, which I recommend. And that helped me to kind of build a network a little bit and get a taste of some other people that were building amazing things. And that sort of served as a spark of inspiration. But what really lit the fire under me was, my daughter, she had a job offer. We didn't know at the time, but going into COVID, she had a very long notice period, like a 6-week notice to her previous employer before starting this new job. And week 4 of that window was basically March 15th when everything locked down. And at the time they were like, "Oh, no, no, you still have a job." But then a week later, they pulled back the offer and she was left, now she had stepped out of her old job and had nowhere new to go. And basically she decided at that point to build a business, and she figured she had, nothing to lose at that point.
Right.
And she has built this incredible business doing project management for interior designers, which I could barely wrap my head around. But
Of course. Yeah.
that set a fire under me in a way of like, wow, this is possible. Like you can actually step out and do this. And then I went through my own journey. I applied to probably like 200 jobs over 2021 and got about, 6 rejection letters and then not much else. And so that set a pretty clear signal to me that whatever this whatever this new opportunity was going to be, it wasn't going to be, going and working for somebody else. And through that career accelerator, I made some contacts that allowed me, like I said, some experimentation to kind of go out and get some early clients and just sort of test to see if I could monetize this thing. And that test didn't really take off until I really made the leap. And then once I stepped out and gave notice to my job is when my calendar just started filling up and all these things started building momentum in a really positive way.
That's great. So we learn from our kids.
Yeah, exactly.
Nice, nice. Dave Clark, when I'm thinking about headhunting and employment and putting people in the right position, what's your perspective with all of that? And maybe a good question for John from you.
I want to kind of equate it to being a baseball coach, which is, what my life's work has been after playing. But I think, John, I sit here and I'm listening to the conversation, and you're trying to pair people with employment opportunities. And so I'm assuming you have got to know that person's strength and weaknesses. As a baseball coach, I think I really tried to get to know my players' strengths and weaknesses, as well as some of the personalities, even off the field, so that when time came, I could plug these players in to positions in the batting order and out in positions on the field where I felt their strengths gave them a better chance of success. Because I've always found out that success breeds confidence, and in return, confidence breeds success. So the question I have for you is, how do you go about in your new endeavor? How do you go about pairing these people up with employment opportunity?
That's a great question. And, I think ultimately you really hit the nail on the head. And, you can ask people point blank sometimes. And if someone had asked me in that previous year, I don't know that I would have been able to formulate the right answer. A lot of times we go through, we don't necessarily know what our dream job is or what our ideal fit is going to be. And so I try to ask some leading questions that, can sort of take someone down the path. And, so there's some certain brass tacks stuff, like certain fundamentals you have to get out of the way. How much money do you need to meet your obligations geographically? What are your limitations, or, what's your ideal sort of, target zone for a particular job. Of course, a lot of people now want to work remote or hybrid, but then you get into, looking at someone's work history and talking to them about where they see themselves in the future. And through that, you kind of peel back the onion a little bit. And, I have a somewhat of a unique way of going through this in my view, where, folks that apply to the jobs that I post, I call them and I talk to them. And I know that's a little unconventional in today's job market. We have so many of these decisions being made by computer programs and AI
Right.
systems and stuff. So that's been my technique.
Okay. Yeah, and I always had a hands-on approach myself as a coach manager, and try to get to know, as I said, the player off the field as well, because that tells you a lot about them. So that's unique. I mean, I know you can't hang out, so to speak, with the people that you're trying to employ, but it sounds like you're kind of going down the same path that I did with the players.
Well, I had an instinct early on to, I don't think I really formulated this in my mind necessarily, but I was kind of rushing through the process. And as I imagine, in your experience, that you can't rush, greatness or outcomes in that way. I found myself in a call with a potential candidate, and from my background, I'd done a lot of hiring, start to be able to size up people fairly quickly. It's like, okay, well, you know what, I'll take a chance on you. I think you'll be a fit, or pretty quickly deciding someone isn't a fit, but what I found is that in that sort of rush, I was ruining the outcome, and the person wouldn't be bought in to the job that I was trying to match them to. And so I slowed things way down by breaking up one conversation into three. And so, you know, get a little bit along in the process, and then I would sort of stop short and schedule another call. And in today's job market, so many people are kind of ghosting and like not showing up. And by putting that little bit of friction in the process and making sure the person is, peddling their share of the way as well, and willing to schedule that call and then frankly show up when they say they're going to show up is a big test to get that buy-in, get that skin in the game on the candidate side. And I found that to be really helpful.
So, John, how do you look at the employment market right now? I hear so many employees, worrying about they can't get pilots, they can't get people to watch the gates, they can't get people to wait on tables. I've noticed the amount of service that I get when I travel has just really gone downhill. The things that you kind of expected just simply aren't there. A restaurant, you're waiting, like Dave and I were eating at a restaurant the other day, I won't name the chain, in Miami. It was Friday, but we were waiting when they had many tables open. And the only reason we were waiting is because they didn't have enough people to service the tables to put us there.
Yeah.
So how does that affect the whole, what's going on in this market world as we're literally talking on the day of a big vote today, and we don't get political, but that's the reality, is that there's a lot of things going on, a lot of moving parts in this world.
I didn't grab my "I voted" sticker because I don't have any plans taking me out of the house today, and I forgot that I'd be on here. But you raised a really great point. I want to sort of preface by saying I don't consider myself an expert. I mean, I'm certainly working in the job market, and I feel I'm still pretty new to this, and I also feel like I'm viewing everything through kind of a pinhole as opposed to a telescope or a microscope. But that said, I have some theories, and I think coming out of COVID, where everything was locked down, certainly in Florida, not for as long as in other places, I think people got a bit of a shock to the system to say, maybe I don't want to work where I'm working, and I want to instead, do some training or focus on some future phase of my career. And people kind of realize that, it's not, you hear a lot of people talk about, well, people don't want to work today. And I don't think that's accurate. I think people don't want to work the way that they were working or the way they had to work in the past. And there are certain jobs that I think, most people don't think of as long-term career paths. And, either by virtue of the type of work that it is, or the treatment that you get from the customers or the employers, frankly, or certainly the pay. And, those are jobs that are frankly really hard to fill. And I think most people, whether it's a creator economy, I mean, right now we're on a podcast that you guys have created, and I think a lot of people have realized they can do something similar to that and not necessarily have to be exposed to the public, in a grocery store or in a restaurant. There was this phrase, essential workers, and I think a lot of people looked around and sort of saw that they were in this essential worker pool, but maybe they didn't feel like they were being treated like they were essential. The byproduct of that is I talked to a lot of people who, frankly, don't have strong base of skills to allow them to move up into the other parts of the job market, where maybe they do want to work from home or work remotely, but they don't necessarily have that background or that foundation.
Right.
So there's a big disconnect right now. And certainly there are more jobs available, right now, as we talk in November of 2022, more jobs available than there are people to fill them. But I think also the people that are looking don't necessarily match into the openings that we need them.
Right.
That's my rambling answer to that, Doug.
No, that's great. And so, I want to transition a little bit because, we talk about the pulling each other along being what pulled you along in your business and life. And so let's transition to more of a personal level. And, what are those things, or maybe a story that you have that's pulled you along in your personal life that's really made John Brandis who John Brandis is now, the Headhunter?
Well, I appreciate that. I worked with a guy for years in my past life who basically started about a year after I had started at this company, and then he still works there today. So we worked together for, basically 18 years.
Wow.
And he was, when he came on his first day, he's a quadriplegic. And so he was confined to a chair. And, I see the work you guys were doing down in Miami at the Abilities Expo, and, really warms my heart thinking about this friend of mine. And, having helped him through some certain physical challenges, whether it's, just, wheeling into a building or what have you. He's just somebody who was such an inspiration to me, you had every, right, or excuse, let's say, to basically stay at home and collect a check. He's injured, and I don't think anybody would question whether or not he could work, so to speak, in quotes. But instead, chose a different path for himself, and had decided that he was going to work not just full time. We were working a pretty full schedule at that place, and 50 hours a week at times, and cranking out a living. And I remember one time where, at the time I wasn't yet married to my wife, but, she was in my office, and we were all complaining, grousing, as people do. Right. I mean, frankly, I've been doing a little bit today. Like, oh, my back hurts, and I've got this pain, or I've got a headache. I said, I have a headache or something. And then he and I had shared an office. And so he's sitting behind us, and he goes, yeah, I broke my neck. I'll never walk again. And boy, if that didn't just, shut us down, pretty quickly. And he wasn't that kind of guy that would, kind of, rub your nose in it like that. But it just took that one time to sort of, he just always had been, I should say, a really cheerful guy, huge smile, bright blue eyes. And he's someone who I think, even as I would be pushing him along up a ramp or something, he definitely was pulling us all along as an example of, how to go about life, and how to get the most out of it.
Perfect example, John. I'm pulling someone along while being pulled along. So it happens to everybody. I mean, I'll share a quick story with you. Even though I had crutches, braces, and people looked at me and might have said, I feel sorry for that guy. I never felt sorry for myself. And I've told this story many times, but that guy put things in perspective for you when you were complaining. He gave you a different perspective that you had to look at. And a little girl in a wheelchair did the same thing for me when I was a player. I had played probably the worst game of my career. And I went in the clubhouse, and I was sulking, and I was taking my crutch and beating it against a pole. And one of my teammates came in and said somebody wanted to see me outside. And I said a few expletives and told him to get away from me. And he continued to tell me somebody wanted to see me outside until he said, look, there's a dad with a little girl in a wheelchair out there that want to see you. And that stopped me in my tracks. I went out to see him, and I immediately started thinking of myself. I told the little girl and the dad, I said, I'm sorry you had to see that terrible performance that I put on today. And the little girl kept going, but you don't understand. And finally I said, well, what don't I understand? And she says to me, she said, you don't understand that you are on the field. And that's all it took. I never forgot that. Never forgot it. She was looking at it from a whole different perspective than I was. And she put me in my place, just like that guy put you in your place.
Yeah, it's powerful, right? I mean, earlier you talked about the weaknesses, and I think and I don't think it's insurmountable by any means, but one of the biggest weaknesses people have, and if I'm talking to a potential candidate, I wear a number of different hats in that process, right? Like I'm trying to serve my client the job, and make sure I'm screening people to identify the right person. But I'm also on the same side as the candidate, and trying to ensure that they get the best fit for themselves. Because if it's a mismatch, that doesn't do me any good. I'll end up to fill that spot again, if I'm lucky, or I'll lose the relationship with my customer. But one of the things, and I often find myself kind of switching back and forth in an exchange where, if someone is, as we're talking, they start to go down a rabbit hole of negativity, for example, and they start, complaining about, their old boss or the old company, and how it, set them on the wrong path or whatever. I usually will sort of pause in the conversation and say, and I'm kind of funny about it. I'm like, well, I'm taking off my hat here, and I'm switching to, my other hat where I'm on your team. And I just wanted to point out that, I don't think that talk is doing you any good. And certainly if you're talking to the employer in an interview setting, you don't want to be saying anything that could be viewed as negative, because employers will, write somebody off based on that. And it's an interesting position to be in, where, a lot of times I think, especially in my past life, when I was just the hiring manager, I wouldn't necessarily open up the curtain and show them what the wizard was thinking. It would just be, well, this person has now disqualified themselves. And I feel lucky that I get to kind of coach people along in that way.
That's great. That's great, John. So, well, thank you. There's so many things that we could talk about, obviously, on these shows, and we appreciate your headhunter business, and what I appreciate when I was reading is you're truly trying to fit people in the right position for their dream jobs, and if you can get somebody in their dream job or their dream business, whatever it may be, then in that case you are helping pull them along. You're helping the employer because you're matching them up with the right people, and so I wish you much success in that. But how do people learn about you? How do they get to you? LinkedIn, your websites. Where do they find you?
Yeah, great, Doug. Thank you. And you guys obviously do amazing work, and I'm really proud to be associated with you in whatever small way. The best way is probably SalesBountyHunter.com. So SalesBountyHunter.com, and in that way you can get to all the other connections, LinkedIn and everything else.
Very good. And we can put those things in the notes. And again, if you're still listening, please do follow us on our podcast. Check us out, follow us, give us a comment, to give us a little review. All of those things are helping us. Our numbers are actually growing. So whoever's listening out there, we really appreciate it. And then we'll see you next time on the Pulling Each Other Along podcast. Thank you for joining us on this episode of the Pulling Each Other Along podcast. If you were inspired today, please share this episode and let us know in the comments section. Don't forget to thank and let those great people in your life know how they pulled you along.